You are 12 years old. Right now, at this exact age, you are worrying about school. About friends. About whether someone you like actually likes you back. You are, by every modern definition, a child. A protected, unhurried child with years of adolescence still ahead of you. Now travel back 300 years. Same age. Same body. Same brain, still wiring itself together in ways scientists don't fully understand even today. Except in that world, on the Great Plains, in the eastern woodlands, in the desert southwest, at 12, you might already be considered a woman. You might already be married. You might already be pregnant. And nobody around you would have blinked. This is the story of why Native American girls sometimes had children so young. And it is not the story most people think it is. It is not simply that they were ignorant. It is not that they didn't care about their daughters. The real answer is stranger, darker, and in some ways more impressive than any of that. It involves biology bending under pressure, brutal survival mathematics, and a truth about the human body that most of us have never been told. Because here is what nobody tells you. The age at which Native American women had children wasn't really a choice in the way we think of choices today. It was the output of a survival equation, running in the background of an entire community, where waiting was often not something anyone could afford. Before anything else, let's knock down the explanation most people jump to immediately. Because it sounds logical, it gets repeated constantly, and it is almost completely wrong. You have probably heard that life expectancy in ancient and pre-modern times was around 30 years old. And so the obvious conclusion is, of course they had children young. They were basically already halfway to death by their teenage years. They had to rush. This is one of the most repeated and most misleading statistics in popular history. Life expectancy at birth in pre-modern Native American communities was low, yes. Sometimes dramatically low. But that number is dragged down almost entirely by one catastrophic factor: childhood mortality. In many pre-modern populations, a third to half of all children died before the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, harsh winters, accidents, all of it stacked against the very young. But here is the twist. If you survived childhood, if your body made it past those first brutal years, your remaining life expectancy jumped dramatically. Healthy adults in many Plains tribes lived well into their 50s and 60s. Elders were not some rare, mythical category. They were real, present, central figures in tribal life, respected precisely because they had survived long enough to accumulate knowledge that kept everyone else alive. So the logic of everyone was about to die, so they had to reproduce fast, doesn't hold up cleanly once you actually look at the numbers. The real story is more specific, more biological, and honestly more interesting than a simple average lifespan could ever capture. Here is where the biology gets genuinely fascinating, and where most people have never been told the full story. Puberty in girls has not always arrived on the same schedule it does today. This is documented, measurable, and important. In wealthy, well-nourished modern nations, the average age of a girl's first menstrual period sits around 12 to 13 years old. But that number has actually been dropping over the last century and a half, not rising. In parts of Europe in the mid-1800s, the average age of first menstruation was closer to 15 or 16. Why the difference? Nutrition. A girl's body, in a very real physiological sense, is running a constant internal calculation. It monitors fat stores, caloric intake, overall energy availability, because pregnancy and nursing are enormously expensive processes in terms of calories. A body that does not have reliable, abundant nutrition will often delay puberty deliberately, as a kind of biological insurance policy. Starting reproduction before you have the energy reserves to sustain it is a losing bet. The body knows this. It waits. This is called the concept of critical fat mass. And the pattern is well documented across populations and history. Which means that in Native American communities experiencing food scarcity, and there were many, particularly in harsh winters or years when hunts failed, puberty for many girls did not arrive at 12. It arrived later. Sometimes considerably later. 15, 16, sometimes older in times of genuine hardship. The picture of all Native American girls universally having children at 12 starts to get complicated the moment you actually look at the biology. But, and this is where it flips, in communities with reliable food supply, with successful hunting seasons and well-stocked winter stores, puberty could arrive earlier. And in many tribal nations, marriage and childbearing did follow physical maturity relatively quickly. Not because nobody cared. Because the world they lived in made waiting a gamble that cost lives. Here is the real engine underneath everything. The part that explains why communities made the decisions they made, even when those decisions look incomprehensible from where we stand today. Imagine you are living in a small plains tribe. 20, 30, maybe 50 people. Your community is not stable the way modern populations are. It is under constant threat, from disease that arrives without warning and kills a third of a village in a single winter. From rival tribes competing for the same hunting grounds. From famine when the buffalo herds shift unexpectedly. From childbirth itself, which was one of the leading causes of death for women throughout almost all of human history. In this world, every single woman capable of bearing children represents something the entire community cannot afford to lose. Not in a cold, calculating way. In a survival way. The tribe that does not replace the people it loses to disease and violence and harsh winter simply disappears. Not gradually. Quickly. Anthropologists and evolutionary researchers who study these populations describe something called high extrinsic mortality, death rates driven by external forces rather than aging. When extrinsic mortality is high, populations shift toward earlier reproduction. Not because of ignorance. Because the math demands it. In a low mortality environment, like the one you live in right now, with vaccines and hospitals and reliable food supply, waiting to have children makes complete sense. You will almost certainly survive long enough to do it later. Your children will benefit from a more mature, more resourced parent. But in a high mortality environment, waiting is a gamble. Because later might not come. Because the woman who was going to have children next year died of a winter illness. Because the family that delayed too long left no descendants to continue. This is visible in the archaeological record. Skeletal analysis from burial sites across North America shows evidence of young mothers, sometimes very young by modern standards, alongside clear physical evidence of the toll that early childbearing took on still developing bodies. The human female pelvis can actually continue developing until the late teens or even early 20s. Giving birth before that development is complete carries real, serious risk. It happened anyway. Repeatedly. Across many different communities and time periods. Because the pressure toward reproduction, when survival itself was the question, was powerful enough to override even those very real risks. That is not comfortable to sit with. It is true. Here is the piece of this story that almost never gets mentioned. And it is one of the most genuinely fascinating ideas in all of evolutionary anthropology. Human females are unusual among mammals in one very specific way. They experience menopause, the end of their reproductive years, and then continue living for decades afterward. Sometimes 30 or 40 years beyond the point where they can no longer bear children. Almost no other species does this. From a purely evolutionary standpoint, once an animal can no longer reproduce, there is very little selective pressure keeping it alive. So why do human grandmothers exist? The grandmother hypothesis proposes that older women who could no longer bear children themselves became enormously valuable to their communities by helping raise and provide for their grandchildren instead. By doing so, they freed younger mothers to have more children sooner and closer together, because there was an experienced, capable support system already in place to help carry the load. In Native American tribal communities, this was not theory. It was daily reality. A young Native American mother at 13 or 14 was not raising her child alone. She was surrounded by her own mother, her aunts, her grandmother, experienced women who had raised children themselves, who knew which plants helped with infant illness, who could take the baby when the young mother was exhausted, who could nurse the child if the mother became ill. Anthropologists call this alloparenting, childcare provided by individuals other than the biological parents. In most traditional Native American communities, raising children was never a two-person job. It was distributed across an entire extended family structure, across the whole community. This distributed support system made early motherhood, while still genuinely risky, more survivable and sustainable than it would be for an isolated modern teenager with no support network at all. The grandmother was not just a family member. She was, in a very real sense, part of the reason the young mother and child survived. Here is something that gets lost whenever this topic is discussed. Native Americans were not one group. They were hundreds of distinct nations, each with their own specific practices, values, social structures, and relationship to the land. The age of first childbearing varied enormously across different tribal nations, different regions, and different time periods. Among some hunter-gatherer nations, particularly those requiring high levels of physical activity and experiencing seasonal food scarcity, first births for women tended to occur considerably later than popular imagination suggests, closer to 18 or 19 rather than 12. Researchers studying traditional foraging communities have consistently found that nutritional stress, intense physical demands, and lower average body fat can delay the onset of fertility significantly, echoing the biological reality we discussed earlier. Among more agriculturally established communities, where grain and food storage provided more consistent nutrition, marriage and childbearing ages could trend younger, driven partly by biology and partly by the social and economic systems that agricultural life created around inheritance, alliances, and household stability. Among many Plains tribes, cultural coming-of-age ceremonies, like the ceremonies we discussed in a previous video, formally marked a girl's transition into womanhood and eligibility for marriage. But those ceremonies did not automatically mean immediate marriage or immediate childbearing. Tribal elders, family structures, and individual circumstances all shaped what happened next. Generalizing too broadly, saying all Native American girls had children at 12, flattens a diversity that spanned hundreds of distinct nations across an entire continent, each responding differently to their specific environment, food supply, and social structure. What we can say is this: in conditions of high mortality and survival pressure, the cultural space between physical maturity and expected adult responsibilities was thin to non-existent. Not because Native Americans didn't value childhood, but because their world required adult contribution to begin as soon as the body could manage it. So why did Native American girls sometimes have children so young? Not because their communities were ignorant. Not because they did not love their daughters. But because the world they lived in ran a constant, brutal survival calculation, and that calculation, under conditions of high mortality, disease, and unpredictable food supply, pushed toward early reproduction as one of the only reliable paths to keeping families, communities, and entire cultures alive. And they did not face it alone. Grandmothers, aunts, experienced women of the community, the entire tribal support network caught the young mothers and their children, distributing the weight of childrearing across hands that had done it before and knew how. What is remarkable is how quickly this changed once conditions allowed it to. As nutrition improved, as child mortality fell, as winters became survivable with better technology, the age of first childbearing began rising across Native American communities, just as it did across every other culture on Earth when survival stopped demanding otherwise. The extended childhood you live inside right now, the years of school, of figuring yourself out, of being protected from adult responsibility, is not the natural state of human life. It is a luxury. A modern, hard-won luxury built on top of everything those generations endured to get us here. And somewhere in the history of this continent, there is a very young Native American mother, maybe 13, maybe 14, maybe younger, who took an enormous risk simply by giving birth. Who was caught by the women around her. Who survived. And whose unbroken chain of descendants eventually leads, after countless generations, to the world we live in today. That is not a comfortable thought. But it is a true one. And it is worth remembering. If this changed how you think about history, let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into how Native Americans actually lived.